Ladies and gentlemen, start your engines. It's time for Drive Time, another edition of Drive Time, where I talk to you, a largely audio only uh, episode or entry here, as opposed to Ask Chuck Dixon, where I provide a lot of visuals. But a whole bunch of you have said you enjoy when I go into depth and go off on tangents um, and talk at length on inside baseball stuff about writing, about comics, about whatever. And you enjoy listening to these while you're working, while you're commuting, while you're basically doing other tasks. And I'm hopefully I'm entertaining or at least distracting you with, with my ramblings. So this entry, I want to talk about writing an answer in specifically with one property that I've created. The question I get all the time from people, which is, where do you get your ideas? Where does a writer's ideas come from? And largely, this is going to be the origin of Levon Cade. I'm going to tell you where the whole story of how Levon Cade came to be and how Levon Cade came to be a movie, which is opening today. Make sure you see it with someone you love. Um, Jason Statham movie, in case you're not plugged into any of my social media and haven't been near a bus stop or watched YouTube or been to a movie theater recently, you might not know that A Working Man, based on my first Levon Cade novel, opens today in theaters all over the world. It has a same day opening in almost every country on the planet. So, um, and where did this idea come from? How did all of this start? Um, well, largely, Levon Cade was created um, almost. He was inspired, let's say, by my wife. Um, the She had read an article. I think she had read an article in Wall Street Journal um, about a young girl still in high school, and she wrote a novel and she self-published it. And this is during the dawn of the ebook thing. You know, uh, Amazon had created the Kindle, and people were starting to read books on their tablets, on their devices, and eventually would be reading them on their phones. But this young girl wrote this novel. Remember, still not out of high school. She wrote a novel. Good for her. Novel writing is hard, and she did it at a very young age. And apparently, it's a very capable novel and a very entertaining novel. I never read it. I can't even remember the name of her or her novel, but she published it through Kindle, and she made a freaking fortune. I mean, she was in mid six figures selling these books because there weren't that many original ebooks out, and the traditional book publishers had not yet entered the fray. So there was only a certain number of ebooks out there, and so she grabbed an audience. Awesome. And of course, she wrote more, and she wrote more, and she wrote more, and she made a boatload of money from ebooks. And this was the beginnings of the ebook gold rush. And my wife, the perfect writer's wife, absolutely the perfect writer's wife, kept saying, why don't you do that? Why don't you write a novel and put it in ebook? And as she will tell you, my answers were pretty vociferous. Uh, I'm not aggressive for the most part, but when it comes to my writing and stuff like that, I got a little bit, my pushback was a little bit too hard. Saying, no, I'm a comic book writer. I don't want to hear about writing prose. I'm not interested in writing prose. Really, the real reasons for my, reactions were I found writing prose intimidating. I've read lots and lots of books, and as I've said before, writing comics is not as intimidating because it's in my DNA. It's something I know that I'm good at. I'm not bragging. It's just this is my party trick. This is what I can do. I work in the comic book medium. I can tell stories, engaging stories, in a sequential series of static images. And you know, But prose intimidated me because you go to write a novel and you're up against, literary giants going back centuries. And and I was like, wow, do I really want to enter that? Do I have that skill set? And I didn't really believe that I did. I didn't have any faith in myself. But she kept coming back to me as she heard more and more about these successes in self-publishing in the ebook trade, and said, she made all the right arguments. You can own it, you'll make all the money from it. You won't have to deal with a publisher. You can write what you want. And that, even that, I can write what I want, but what do I want to write? Even that was intimidating. I was just, um, boxing myself into a corner. And the more and more she would bring it up, very gently bring it up, maybe you might want to think about this, the more, um, the worse my reactions got to it. I was starting to get a little angry at her, and but she wouldn't give up. I was starting to get a little annoyed. Like, stop bringing this up. I'm a comic book writer. I have no, delusions of grandeur. I have no wishes to get into the prose form. And really, it was. I was intimidated. I was, let's face it, afraid to try to enter that arena. I pretty much, had established myself as a successful comic book writer. I couldn't see recreating that in prose form. I just didn't think I had the chops. But things happened. I mean, in the early 2000s, into the 2010s, I was no longer welcome at Marvel in DC. There wasn't that much comic book work out there. I was doing some work for IDW on G.I. Joe. I think at this point I was still working for Bongo doing Simpson stories. I was picking up jobs here and there, but there was no guarantee of any long-term employment like I had at DC, where I would get on a title and stay on it for 100 issues. That just wasn't happening anymore for anybody, and it especially wasn't happening for me. And so I was back to basically the beginning of my career, hunting down one freelance assignment after another, with no guarantees of any kind of long-term employment. And so I had to keep coming up with more and more creative ways to find work. And by work, I mean writing. God forbid, I actually had to go out and get a job. The greatest fear of any freelance creator is that they might have to actually go back to getting a paycheck at a job, leave the house, put on clothing, leave the house and go get a job. And I did not want that. Well, along comes Dynamite Comics, or Dynamic Forces, or whatever they're calling themselves this week. And the owner there offered me a chance to write a novel. They were going to pay me in advance. What had happened was Osama bin Laden had been killed by SEAL Team 6. It was all over the news. It was all anybody could talk about. And the Nick Barucci, the guy who is the head honcho CEO, founder, and all the rest of it at Dynamic, contacted me and said, we want to get a novel about SEAL Team 6 out by Christmas, for Christmas sales, which means, before Thanksgiving. And this is like September. This is like right after Osama bin Laden had been killed. And he said, could you write us a novel about SEAL Team 6? And he specifically wanted a novel, a fictional account of the death of Osama bin Laden. And they were going to promote the hell out of it because it was in the news. It was hot. And he wanted to be the first one to press with a novel about this. And he says, could you write a novel in 30 days? If I could write a novel in 30 days, they could prep it, proof it, get it up on Kindle, and start promoting it. And I thought, or I didn't even really think, it was just a knee-jerk reaction, largely coming from my wife whispering in my ear, write a novel, write a novel, write a novel. And I realized this might be the only way I'll ever write a novel because the gauntlet has been thrown. Not only can you write a novel, but can you write in 30 days? I'm a guy who's no good with goals. I'm only good with deadlines, if you understand. There's a distinct difference between having a goal, I'm going to do this someday, and having a deadline, I got to do this by Friday. So with a 30-day deadline, I said yes, and they paid in advance. And then I was going to get the rest when I was finished with the novel. And then there was a promise of royalties, and I'll get into that in a minute. I think you know where I'm going with that when I said there was a promise of royalties. So anyway, I wrote it, but I didn't write what they wanted. I wrote because I didn't know enough. Nobody knew enough about the Osama bin Laden raid, and I didn't want to besmirch or tread upon or exploit the actual lives of the guys who were on the raid. So I didn't write about the death of Osama bin Laden because I thought it was ridiculous. My first novel is going to be shot full of holes for, and so I wrote a different novel and intimated that some of the characters in my story in the SEAL team pod that my characters were part of, I just intimate that they were on that raid that night to kill Osama bin Laden. And I told an entirely different story. Now, about 2 weeks into writing, less than that, maybe a week into writing this, I heard from an editor at Dynamic. He had been assigned to edit this book. And he called me and he says, hey, we haven't seen an outline or anything from you. I mean, are you going to get started on this novel? And I said, I'm about 6 chapters in already. I started the day after I told Nick yes. I started before the advance check even showed up. And he said, but we need to see an outline. And I said, well, I would have to stop writing to write you an outline. You either get the novel in 30 days or I can write you an outline. If I start writing you an outline, I'm never going to meet this deadline. I'm flying by the seat of my pants here. I will have a novel to you in 30 days. In fact, I had a novel to them in 28 days. I beat their deadline by 2 days. And they were very happy with it, and they published it, and it sold gangbusters. And I wrote 5 more, and we parted ways on SEAL Team 6 because I wasn't getting any royalties. And I wasn't real hip to Amazon and Kindle sales, but I was watching it where it ranked on the Amazon page for the books. And it was ranking really high. And it was consistently high in the rankings in its genres, military thriller, that kind of thing, and espionage. It was ranking really high up there and consistently staying up there. And I figured these numbers mean something. These numbers mean sales. I didn't know anything about Kindle. I didn't know anything about pages read at this time, but I could see there's money here. And so I got into a little bit of a tussle with Dynamic over royalties. I mean, where are these royalties? If this thing's selling, you seem very happy with it. You seem very anxious to get the next book. And I did write the next few books. I mean, I was in the SEAL Team 6 business there for a year or so, just writing these books. And somewhere along the line, the staff at Dynamic really liked these books. The accounting, people like that, they were reading them and they really liked them. And I was hearing from them how much they liked these books. And one of them included me in an email chain, either by accident or design, an email chain that had the charts for the sales figures. And I saw what these things were selling. And I got even more demanding about royalties. And I refused to write the 6th book. And I was told, if you don't write the 6th book, we'll sue you because you signed a contract saying you would write 6 books. And I said, good luck suing a comic book creator. Be the first comic book company to sue a comic book creator. See how that works out for you. So I said, I want some royalties. I want a check. I want a piece of this. So it sent me a check. It was a pittance compared to what I should have received. And of course, it was the last royalty check I ever got because I couldn't blackmail them any further after I'd written the 6th book. And I did write the 6th book. largely because I'm a dope and I wanted to basically end the story for this cast of characters that I'd really come to like. So, and they were alive in my mind, and I wanted to complete their story for the most part. Um, so I stopped writing them, and then they brought on another writer, and the series failed because I think readers were responding to what my style of writing, my kind of stories, and they simply couldn't recreate that. They could probably start the series up again now with AI if they are interested, but I don't know if that's going to happen. So, anyway, that ended, but I'd learned how to write novels. In fact, I'd written 6 of them. So, why not continue? And once again, my wife said, um, you should do this on your own. You should write and self publish your own novels. So, I did. And my first novel, much to my wife's dismay, was a time travel book. My wife doesn't like it when I write time travel. She says I'm schizo when I write time travel. Maybe she's right. I can't argue with her. It does put me in a weird place in my head. Um, and so I wrote Bad Times, the Cannibal Gold, the very first of what would be 6 Bad Time stories. And I chose Bad Times because I like time travel, and I wanted to exploit my connection to SEAL Team 6. So I wrote another adventure featuring a tight knit group of elite soldiers, this time U.S. Army Rangers, who go back in time and make all kinds of trouble for themselves in various periods of history. And it seemed like, okay, this is an easy one for me because I've already done all the research on SEAL Team 6. I just moved that research over to the Rangers, and go for broke. And it did really well. And they continue to do well. And I remember I self-published these. And so then I moved on to create the Levon Cade series. And so for a while there, I was alternating. I would write a Levon book, and I'd write Bad Times. And then I'd write another Levon, another Bad Times. And the Levon books really took off. And so we can say that my wife, helped me create Levon Cade. Absolutely. And I enjoyed writing SEAL Team 6. I really enjoyed writing Bad Times. But when I got to writing the Levon Cade books, everything felt right. For the first time, I felt really comfortable writing prose. And I said, and I didn't know why. What was different about these books than what I had written before? And my answer came from Scott Peterson, my former Batman editor, one of my favorite editors of all time. And I sent him the manuscript. I just wanted somebody else to see what I was writing. And so I sent him the manuscript for Levon's trade. And he got back to me and he said, I read some of your other prose. And he goes, this is the first time you've managed to wed your prose style to your comic book scripting style, so that you've paced this the same way you would pace a comic book story, and it really lends itself to prose. He says this is the first time you sort of come up with this hybrid style, combining your two mediums. And I took that to heart. I found that very, very encouraging, and I realized that what he said was true. Writers, for the most part, unless they're egghead, college professor, graduate student type writers, most writers are oblivious to their own style. They're oblivious to what's appealing about their work or not appealing or anything else. I mean, I'm driven by not boring people. I don't want to bore my readers. So I keep the story boiling as much as possible, keep things moving as much as possible. But that's really the only conscious effort I'm putting in to what we would call style. But every writer has a style because every writer is an individual. And you put a little bit of unless you're a complete hack, you put a little bit of yourself or a lot of yourself into your writing. And this was the first book. The Levon books were the first books that really felt like me. And Scott nailed it. He nailed why. Because I'd sort of backed up into my own comfort zone of writing comics. And I wasn't thinking of Levon Cade as a comic book story, but sort of subconsciously, deep in my subconscious, I was breaking it down into comic book pages in my head. I was seeing it as comic book pages, and so it all worked, and I maintained that style and that degree of rapid fire pace, and I was rewarded with readers saying that the book kept them up all night. They read it in one sitting. They kept carrying the book around with them and reading it at every opportunity. And those are things a writer, especially a genre writer, really wants to hear. And the books again did well. Now, I got in at the tail end of the ebook gold rush. So my first year writing ebooks, I'm going to give you figures here. My first year writing ebooks, and I only had Bad Times and maybe one Levon book out. I made 75 grand. It was all mine. I mean, self-published. I own copyright. I own everything. I was making 75 grand. And I thought, wow, this is awesome. If I can do this every year, I can only build as I write more books. I'll sell more books. And that was the philosophy of every ebook writer. And that's why we were all writing series books, because that's what the Kindle readers apparently wanted. The compulsive reader, the constant reader wanted series books. They wanted to know that the series was going to last a while. So each edition you added to a series theoretically would add to your sales. And once you got to book 4, new readers would pick you up because, well, there's at least 4 of them. And so the more books you added, the more likely series readers, compulsive readers were to latch on and start reading these things. And so that was the theory. Didn't really work out that way. The ebook gold rush fell apart because of its success. Everybody started writing ebooks. Everybody that ever had a novel in their head started writing ebooks and self-publishing them, and the market was flooded. I mean, flooded. You have no idea, and it got worse and worse and worse. Now Amazon was happy because they had more books to sell, and they were making money in the aggregate, which means they were making money off the quantity that was out there. Even if 90% of the books were complete crap and maybe only sold a few hundred copies, Amazon was making money off that few hundred copies of those thousands and thousands of books. And for the future of ebook, it's only going to get worse because AI allows people to write a book in a day, literally a book in a day. We're looking at thousands and thousands of new ebooks every day because of AI. And you'll just be able to crank them out. You'll be able to write books like James Patterson. Just boom, 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 boom. You get an idea, you feed it in AI, and you throw it out there. And it might be complete, unreadable crap or snooze fest or whatever. Amazon doesn't care because it's content that they can sell. And so I was overwhelmed by competition, and my Levon Cade and Bad Time sales began to slide. But I created this property, and I owned it. And that was cool. And my philosophy is I'm a long buck kind of guy. You create something, you don't know. You might not make a whole lot of money on it this year, but you don't know what's going to happen in 5 years and 10 years. You don't know that you might have created a fan who goes on to be a network programmer or a big movie producer or whatever, and they remember this book they read when they were younger. Hey, maybe we can do something with this. We can make a deal. And that's kind of, in a weird way, is what happened. I've told the story before. I'll make it a little bit more brief. I wrote an Expendables prequel, again, for Dynamic. It was an Expendables prequel. It was a prequel to the movie. I had to read the screenplay. I had to read Sylvester Stallone's screenplay for the Expendables and use that for my source material. The movie wasn't out yet. I didn't even know what the characters were going to look like. I knew who was going to play them, so I knew what their voices would kind of sound like in my head. I knew that Jason Statham had to be a Cockney, I knew Dolph Lundgren had to be whatever. I think he was supposed to be a Russian in the movies. So I knew where we were going with that. So I wrote this prequel, and I'm pretty happy with it. And a few months after the movie came out, I get a phone call from Sylvester Stallone himself. Turns out he's a big comic book fan. Turns out he read the prequel and he really liked it. And he really liked how I captured the voices of his characters, the individual voice and the tone that he was going for in the screenplay doesn't really show up in the movie because they had to do a lot of rewriting of dialogue in the movie. But the dialogue in the screenplay is priceless. And there's a patois between the characters, and I was able to adopt that and recreate that in the comic series. And Stallone recognized that. Well, he calls, and within a few minutes, he realizes I'm from Philadelphia, because probably my Philadelphia accent became even more pronounced talking to him. It just sort of came back, and it was, and we just started talking generally about stuff, and then he got to his point, and he said, we're working on Expendables 2. I'm not happy with the screenplay. Would you be interested in doing rewrites on the screenplay with me? And I'm like, oh, hell yeah. I think that would be cool. And I said, sure. And he says, well, I'll talk to the production company, and we'll have you flown out for a production meeting, and we'll pitch something. And in the meantime, if you have any ideas. And so, I worked up some ideas, ran them by him. He liked them. We did a little back and forth. I made some changes, and I flew out there and I pitched it with Sly in the room. And things went well, because in production meetings, everything goes well until you leave. When the door shuts behind you, they start, tearing your ideas apart. They're not going to do it in front of you, because they don't want to, they don't want an emotional scene. So they made it very apparent they didn't want me on this. They didn't want Sly playing with the screenplay. And so they offered me a lowball amount to work on it. That if I did work on it, they weren't out much money. And if I refused to work on it because of the low amount of money, they were happy with that too. They just wanted me to, just wanted to sideline me, make Sly happy, which he wasn't. And then I was gone. I got the Hollywood treatment. I was gone. I was the greatest thing since sliced bread in the morning, and nobody by the next day. And so, came home thinking, that was my Hollywood adventure. I got to meet Sly. I got to talk to him. I really liked him, and I got to hang out with a true Hollywood legend. And I thought, well, that's cool. Okay, that's in my bio. That's in my backstory, and I was fine with that. No animosity, no hard feelings. But Sly kept talking to me, and he got me work on doing some web content for Lionsgate. We were going to do this CGI animated series, and Sly was going to voice the main character, and it was called Mexifornia, and it was about Mexico, about the United States after the Chinese had exploded. Either it was a Chinese or a solar flare had created an electromagnetic pulse all over North America that knocked out all the electricity, all of the digital, all the crap. The thing that you're listening to me on now wouldn't work anymore. And basically, North America was thrown back to the technology of the 1920s. And Sly is dealing with cartels and all kinds of crazy. It had a tone like Demolition Man. It was going to be pretty cool, but I wrote. It was supposed to be, I think, 6 episodes. I think I wrote 3 of them, and they pulled the plug. But I got paid, and I thought, well, that's very nice. Sly, like as an apology to me, got me this little gig here, and it was fun. And I got, again, got to talk to him some more. And in talking to him, I sent him my first Bad Time books and my first Levon Cade books to read. And I sent him a whole bunch of copies so he could hand them out to his staff. In case he didn't read them, somebody on his staff would read them. Well, he read them. Well, anyway, he got me some more work doing the dialogue on an Expendables video game that was voiced by the original cast, and that was cool, and that was a lot of fun, and it paid very well. And then he got back to me and he says, I really like Bad Times. I really like Levon Cade, and he said I'd like to option them for movie, TV, whatever we can do, and you know it'd be fun. Let's do that. You know. And I said, great. And he says, well, I'm going to start with Levon Cade because Bad Times would obviously be a higher budget to do because it's got proto-humans in it and all kinds of sets that would have to be built specific to the movie, and he's in a larger cast. And he said, so let's start with Levon Cade. And I'm saying, great. So I optioned it once, and the option ran out because he couldn't get it placed anywhere, and COVID shows up, and COVID kicks like a 2-year hole in everything in entertainment production, and so nothing really happens except Sly writes. He's stuck at home and he's a workaholic. He's stuck at home, so he wrote like the first 3 episodes of a proposed Levon Cade TV series, and he and I went back and forth on that a little bit. He showed me what he'd written. I made a couple of minor suggestions about things, and it pretty much laid there for a while until the option ran out. And then he calls and he says, what about what would you think if Jason Statham played Levon Cade? And I'm like, okay. And he says, I was talking to Jason and he's really looking for a new franchise. And I told him about Levon Cade, and he's very, very interested. Would you be okay with that? And I said, yeah. And he says, I'll option it again. We'll sign a new option agreement, and you'll get another option check, which he made larger than the previous option check, because that's the way Sly rolls. It's a rarity in Hollywood where he takes care of creators. And he said, your initial payment would be a percentage of the budget. And depending on what the budget is, but he says here, and he gave me a quote, he says, this is the amount, this is the floor amount. If we make this for the lowest proposed budget, this would be the amount we would pay you on the day principal shooting begins. Is that amount okay? And it was a good amount. It was a good amount. And I said, okay. Yeah, I'm fine with that. And he said, good, because if you wanted more, we couldn't make this deal work. And I said, no. I said, that figure is fine. Let's go ahead and do it. Now, because the advance money was hooked to the budget, and the budget went up, the check they eventually sent me was a whole lot sweeter than what I had agreed to. Thank you, Sly. Really took care of me. And the thing is, I signed with Sly. He basically controls the movie rights. I signed him the movie and TV series rights. And, of course, there's an end date. If they stop making movies and everything else, the rights revert to me again. But the point is, I signed with him, not with the studio. Because I thought he's going to protect me. He's going to look out for me. And he has. He has into a spectacular fashion. So, a working man gets made. 10 years later, 11 years later, a working man is going to show up at your movie theater. Well, it's already shown up at your movie theater today. Showings began at midnight last night. And fingers crossed and toes crossed for a big opening weekend. So that was my journey. That's how Levon Cade got created. And I should speak about Levon himself. I mean, he got created, as I've said before, to scratch my Punisher itch. I really like the lone vigilante type character, the kind of guy who, shoots first, asks questions later, and consequently causes all kinds of problems for himself. And I wanted to create a Punisher-like character that was different from the Punisher in that, Levon Cade is not a city guy. He's an Alabama country boy, and he has a daughter. So he has a stake in the game. He's not a psychotic loner. His bridges, his you know, he's not alone in life. He has a little girl to care about, and he has some extended family in Alabama that care about him, that he has to protect and everything else. So unlike the Punisher, who can simply go wherever and do whatever, Levon has responsibilities. He has people to come home to. And that's the difference I want. I wanted the book to have a little bit more heart than the usual, vigil. I mean, Don Pendleton's executioner doesn't have to worry about missing, soccer practice or, the school play. And I wanted a character, not those kind of cliched, contrivances they put in movies, but I wanted a character who had people that he cared about and loved and who loved him. And I also wanted the series to have all the stories to be different. And I wanted it to be, if you've read the 12 books, you can see that it's like a continually deconstructing plot line that runs across the 12 books. You really need to read them in order. They don't, I guess they could stand alone. I've never looked at them as standalone books. I've looked at it as a series where you would finish one and want to read the next one. Not that there's cliffhangers, but you'd want to see what happens next to these folks. And that's the way I created it. And that's what attracted Sly initially, was that I wasn't just retelling the same story over and over again. Levon gets a mission and he goes and he succeeds and everybody's happy. No, it's continually deconstructed plot lines. Unexpected things happen. His way into the stories happen. The types of stories in the series, they're all different. We have, basically an origin story. We have a Die Hard story, a prison story, a war story, a chase story, a revenge story. I mean, these are all different action story tropes that I used in each of the books because I didn't want to be repetitive in any way. And so that's it, man. That's the origin of Levon Cade. It started with my wife, my wife just doggedly pestering me to write a novel, and none of it could have happened without her. So if you see a working man this weekend, you first thank my wife, and then thank Sly, because each one of them bore an equal role in making this happen. So there you have it, the in-depth. This is what you asked for, the in-depth story of Levon Cade. So back to work. Stop pretending to type or do whatever you're doing. I hope to God you're not using power tools. Keep your eyes on the road if you're commuting, and I will see you again. You will hear me again on the next Drive Time.